Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. On various issues and various degrees, most important international powers oppose Iran's aggressive aspirations. That said, a global consensus is lacking vis-à-vis the diagnosis of Tehran's activities and the course of action to thwart them. To analyze this state of play on curbing the Islamic Republic's expansionist policy in the Middle East and beyond, we're joined here in the studio by Dr. Eldad Pardo, who is a research director at Impact SC and a lecturer on Iran at the Hebrew University at Jerusalem. Welcome.
Nice to be here.
I'd like also to welcome our TV7 analyst, Mr. Amir Oren, and Dr. Emily Landau, who is a research fellow or a senior research fellow at the Institute for National Security Studies.
Hi.
Welcome. Mr. Oren, give us a broader understanding on the latest developments, and there are many in the last week and a half.
Well, there are, or most countries are in agreement regarding the need not to give Iran a free pass on three distinct issues. Its quest for nuclear power, perhaps nuclear weapons, its so-called malign activities in Yemen, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon, and perhaps some plans beyond that, and on its ballistic missile program. The differences and the difficulties stem from the different approaches various powers take towards these activities, especially the nuclear issue, because on the ballistic missile issue, there is a United Nations Security Council resolution. It is not binding. It is calling on Iran to do something or refrain from something else, but nevertheless, it does reflect the will of the international community. And on the other activities, there are differences between Russia, especially in Syria, and the United States. On other issues, there are differences between the United States and its Western allies, such as France and Germany. And this has been evident over the last several days, both in Warsaw, in the summit organized by Secretary of State Pompeo, and in Munich at the Munich Security Conference, where Iranian Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif spoke, as did several Western countries, and there was no consensus between them on how to approach the Iranian problem.
Which we'll discuss during today's program. Dr. Landau, I would like to ask you in particular to what Mr. Oren referred to with regard to UN Resolution 2231, specifically with the call for, which the Iranians are always emphasizing, the call for Iran not to undertake in ballistic missile testing and so on. Nevertheless, this specific resolution also calls on the P5+1 to adopt and implement the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which was not signed, but it also uses the same wording for that specifically. Why the calls for Iran not to undertake the ballistic missile program does suddenly pertain to somewhat of a inclination that it should, but it doesn't have to. And when it calls on the member states to implement this technical agreement, suddenly it's binding.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, actually, that you raised. I can tell you about the provision with regard to ballistic missiles. It's very clear that the watered down language that we find in Resolution 2231, as opposed to the resolution from 2010, it was a clear Iranian demand, and the P5+1 caved to this Iranian demand. And there's two main concessions that they made. The first is that it only calls upon Iran. And the second is that it talks about ballistic missiles designed to carry nuclear warheads. And we heard Zarif at the Munich Security Conference mentioning both of those aspects. He says, what do you want from us? It only calls upon us. Plus the fact it says missiles carry nuclear weapons. we have no intent to develop nuclear weapons. So how could we have a ballistic missile that is designed to carry a nuclear weapon?
Nevertheless, he also stopped there and he didn't continue about the components of such ballistic missile technology, which was actually used for sending a satellite into orbit, which failed, of course, twice, but still is part of it.
No, the whole thing is quite cynical on the part of Iran. I'm just saying that this was an Iranian demand, and then we hear Zarif talking about it as if, everyone just agreed to this kind of wording, and therefore there's no obligation on the part of Iran to do anything. Now, with regard to ballistic missiles, as we just heard, here there's more agreement, let's say, between the Europeans at least and the Americans, that this is an issue that needs to be dealt with by the international community. However, the Europeans believe everything can be done just through dialogue. Of course, that's always the case, and they tried to talk to the Iranians. And the minute they raised the ballistic missile issue, the Iranians stormed out of the room. So dialogue isn't really working if you don't have pressure behind that, if you don't have leverage to force Iran to comply with what you want them to comply with. It's not going to work. The Iranians do not want to give up their program.
Dr. Pardo, during this Munich conference, which was highlighted during Mr. Oren's introduction of this topic, there was a lot of you could call it a magnifying glass on the division between the United States and the European Union pertaining to the nuclear agreement with Iran, while the United States was very eager to confront their European counterparts and urging them to withdraw from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which is the technical term of the nuclear agreement with the Islamic Republic. The European Union, in particular, the High Representative on Foreign Policy and Defense, Ms. Mogherini, stated or actually boasted in the fact that the European Union was the reason for this agreement to stay in place. How does this actually work when the United States and the European Union need to also unite forces in trying to curb the Islamic Republic from its expansionist ideals?
Well, if you look at it, it's the whole system holistically. I would say that from the American point of view, it is true that the agreement is there, and the agreement is not good. But actually, what the American did was to take the negotiations of the last stages of the agreement and just moved it to the front, to the beginning, until. In Munich, there was something new from the American side that they actually demanded from Europe to pull out of the nuclear deal, and this was for the first time. What does it mean? It means that until now, the American position was, okay, let's the nuclear deal continue, and we want to negotiate the next stage. Now, from an Iranian point of view, when you read the propaganda inside. They say, we are in the majority, the United States is isolated. But we had the Warsaw Conference. We see quite substantial change in the European position. We see now Saudi Khashoggi, that was kind of isolated, now visiting Pakistan, India, and then China. And you have all this oil money, all the US, and the entire, there is pretty large coalition in the world that would not like to see a united Islamic empire equipped with nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles. So I think it's, in the end of the day, it's Iran against the rest, and they will have to make tough decisions down the road.
Mr. Oren, the main point that also I think Dr. Pardo alluded to was the fact that the Europeans now actually took action. They advanced on their special purpose vehicle, they call it Instax, where they actually provide the Iranians, not in particular with true added value on all consumer goods, but specifically on humanitarian elements, whether it is humanitarian goods pertaining to medical and food-related commodities. To what degree does this actually angered the Americans, considering the fact that it is only limited to the specifics of humanitarian goods. And on the other hand, we heard, of course, Iranian Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif speaking about that this doesn't even come close to what the Iranians demand, and instead of just putting this forward, they need to get wet and jump into the ocean together with Iran.
It's very frustrating for the Trump administration because, of course, it wanted a united front against Iran. It wanted a lot of pressure on the regime. It also expected to see some internal dissent, perhaps demonstrations, an upheaval, which will hopefully result in regime change. This has not yet happened. And in Warsaw, the Americans got a lot less than they expected when they organized the conference. First of all, the invitees, those who accepted the invitations, watered down the entire rationale for the conference by insisting on adding other issues. It was supposed to deal mostly and perhaps solely with Iran, but it was widened to deal with the sources of conflict in the Middle East and so on and so forth. And even in the joint communique following the summit, which was, of course, pre-written, Iran was hardly mentioned. Of course, the Germans and the French abstained from coming to the conference. So while Secretary Pompeo is still going around the world speaking about his 12 demands from the Iranians, the so-called moderate or pragmatic wing in the Iranian regime or Iranian government, represented by Zarif and by President Rouhani, claims that the pressure is not yet working. What they secretly want, perhaps, is that for this pressure to get some effect regarding the Revolutionary Guards. Zarif and Rouhani would love to see Qassam Soleimani, the head of the Revolutionary Guards Quds Force, get smacked. Of course, they can't go out and say it openly. Also, regarding the ballistic missiles, one of Zarif's points was that no one is selling Iran fighter planes. So they must defend themselves somehow. And he goes back to the War of the Cities in the Iran-Iraq War, which, by the way, Iran started. Iran got punished following the Iraqi salvos against Tehran. But Iran started it with its own missiles.
Dr. Pardo, why isn't the pressure working on Iran? Why don't we see the people running to the streets and protesting, knowing that a big margin of the population of Iran is indeed not very keen on having the Islamic Republic or the Islamic regime still in power?
I think first they've been there. They tried it. They tried a revolution, and what they got was a disaster. So they are afraid that another revolution may bring either another awful regime, or even worse, or a civil war. And they really follow closely the situation in the Arab world, and the regime is really pumping on that. They say, we are not Syria, we are the safest country in the Middle East. Of course, recently, there was a series of terrorist attacks inside Iran, but this also play out for the government. Why? Because in Iran, we have only 50% Persians. So the rest are other ethnic groups. So there is a great fear of a civil war ensuing after a potential regime change. So some kind of terrorist attacks inside actually pushes people toward the center. They say, well, we live in an awful situation, but it might even get worse.
May I add, there was a telling detail in Zarif's address to the Munich conference when he went back to history, and the moderator said, well, let's not get back to the 7th century, naming Muhammad and Islam's coming to Persia. And he said, no, I'm talking about the Persian Empire thousands of years ago, which means that he is Persian first and Muslim second.
Dr. Landau?
Well, I actually wanted to say something about the Warsaw Summit. A lot of emphasis has been put on the fact that the Europeans sent lower level diplomats. I think the French and the Germans
Well,
were there, but with a
exclusively.
lower level. I think this was a missed opportunity for the Europeans because the United States watered down the agenda at the behest of the Europeans. It's because they did not want this to be framed as everyone against Iran. So the United States responded to that. They changed the agenda in a step towards the Europeans, and the Europeans are not engaging. The Europeans know exactly what's going on with this regime. They know it as well as the Trump administration, and all of these attempts to undermine the pressure campaign, I think, are quite unfortunate. Plus the fact that we know that they need to have these conversations to get back on track of some common agenda. So, just not showing up, it's very easy, in bon ton to isolate the Trump administration. But the truth is that on the Iran issue, the Trump administration is getting it right. And the Europeans, unfortunately, rather than putting pressure, we see the Germans celebrating with the Iranians the 40-year revolution. The other important thing that happened at Warsaw is that there were conversations between the Israelis and Arab states, the Arab Gulf states. All of the Arab states that participated, except I think for Egypt and Tunisia, did send representatives at the level of foreign minister. And this is an important message.
Which seems to be the main
success. This was the main success, and this was the main drama and dynamic at the Warsaw Summit. And there is this common interest. There are common interests. There's a common enemy, which is Iran. And the fact that these Arab states are being more open about the need to accept Israel into the region, even if the Palestinian issue is not resolved, these states are saying, look, we have our own interests, and there's a limit to how much we will not advance our interests for the sake of the Palestinians who have rejected offer after offer after offer. So it plays well to the Arab street, to talk about the Palestinian cause. But we see at the level of the leaders a growing dissatisfaction with the fact that they have to continually pull back on normalization for the sake of the Palestinians when they aren't doing enough to help themselves.
Mr. Oren, I'd like to actually touch more on the Warsaw Summit. I had the opportunity to speak with some people who attended this conference, also the sessions behind closed doors, which they indicated to me that was quite exclusively focused on the way to curb Iranian malign activities across the Middle East and to see how to push them back to less of an aggressive regime and more of a meager force in the region. But at the same time, the main focus that they put on was the fact that while some European states did not fully commit, they called it, to this summit and to the battle against the Islamic Republic, they did see the fact that Israel and major Arab powers in the region have aligned themselves in the battle against Iran, something that may bear fruit in the future, also not only in the battle against Iran, but also other aspects. To what degree do you think that this was indeed a success and that it wasn't just a follow-up or a show of force to Iran about what actually happens already under the table?
It is a success. There are common interests that Israel shares with several of the Persian Gulf countries or Arabian Gulf countries. But I only partly share your enthusiasm and Emily's because there is a precedent of a threat from the Gulf serving to unite these countries and Israel. And this was the 1990 invasion of Kuwait and the 1991 Desert Storm campaign, where Saddam Hussein was the enemy, and it led to the Madrid conference. First, Israel, Syria, and Egypt were on the same side against Saddam Hussein in the war. Israel did not take part actively because it was asked not to threaten the coalition. Syria and Egypt sent forces to Saudi Arabia. They did not invade Iraq itself, but they took part in the war. And then in the Madrid conference, Israelis and Arabs sat around the same table. Deputy Minister Netanyahu was there. At the time, he was a
He was always there. Right?
yes, a junior member of Yitzhak Shamir's government. And after Madrid, we veered off to Oslo, which was not a direct continuation of Madrid, but nevertheless, it was some progress. And then we had the peace with Jordan. So this is nothing new. And Rabin went to Amman, and we had all of that 25 years ago and more. However, the Arab potentates, the sheiks and the kings and what have you, the monarchs, want to use Israel as a bulwark against Iran, of course. And Israel has its own interests, and that's fine. That's how alliances are being formed. But one should not confuse that with a real rapprochement between Israel and those countries, which will come after the Palestinian problem is at least partly resolved.
So we should ask ourselves
But
who's using
Amir,
whom.
would you have believed, or would all the people that say nothing will happen until the Palestinian issue is resolved, would they have believed 5 years ago that we would even be where we are today? In other words, the change is incremental. Nobody's saying this is full rapprochement. But there is change, and it is significant.
So, Emily, you are a Leninist. The worse it is, the better it gets.
Dr. Pardo?
I would like to point to two things. First of all, it's a major dilemma, major question whether this rapprochement with the Arab states is pragmatic, mainly directed towards Iran, and if the Iran issue will kind of be resolved and we'll have diplomatic relations between Israel and Iran, then the Arabs will run away.
Well, they were quite clear about this, actually, when they said that the Iran issue comes first, and later let's deal with the Palestinian issue.
Yeah, but I would this is not the topic of this discussion, but I believe this was hold even in that case because there is a long list of reasons. Particularly the information revolution and the oil prices plummeting and the Arab Spring, and there is so much has changed, and Israel is really needed. It's not only Israel is needed, the conflict is not needed. So that's one thing. Another point I wanted to speak about the Europeans and the Americans. I'm among other things studying school textbooks, and in the Iranian school textbooks, they focus on Islamic awakening in Europe and how to convince Europeans to become Muslims. So these missiles are directed towards Europe. The Iranian strategy since 40 years ago is first and foremost to take over Mecca and Medina, and then to become the center of Islam, and with so much power, so much oil, so much ballistic missiles, then move up north and take Europe. And this is that's why all this pressure on Iran is much more important for the Europeans than for the Americans, because even though the Iranians are sending their ships to the Atlantic Ocean, I don't see such a danger to the United States.
So the Iranians are implementing a Shiite version to the version of the Muslim Brotherhood and Sunni Muslims?
It's exactly the same. It's not Shiite. People, it's like Professor Hassan from Jerusalem, he said it's a pre-cleavage ideology. It's an ideology of Muhammadan pre-cleavage, and they share the same ideology with the Muslim Brethren. And of course, there was recently an article about it, but since the 90s, they collaborate tightly with Al-Qaeda because the idea is to unite the Arab, the Muslim world in a militaristic, Islamistic, innovative ideology. And by the way, many Shiites, I would say most of the Shiites are not happy with Khomeinism. They would like to see democracy and advancement.
Dr. Landau?
On what point?
Well, I would like to ask you with regard, as we don't have very much time left on the program, with regard to the Iranian angle to all of this. The Iranians, of course, look at this. They try to advance their ideology in a very pragmatic way at some level, and also it's trying to justify its actions to the West in a language that the West understands. When we're talking about Israeli efforts to thwart Iranian military entrenchment in Syria, we hear the Iranians say, yes, but they invited us and you're in breach of international law. So where is the Iranian actually angle in all of this?
Unfortunately, the moderator of that discussion with Foreign Minister Zarif didn't ask him about all the missiles that they transferred to the hands of Hezbollah. Was that, does that also fall under they were invited and it's not creating an actual threat to Israel? In other words, when you listen to Zarif, it's almost humorous because he just turns everything around. By the way, this is a well-known Iranian tactic. Whatever accusation is thrown at the Iranians, they turn it around and throw it right back in the face of the Americans and say they're guilty of the same thing. And we heard this from Zarif over and over. He also claimed to be he said, I'm a human rights professor. Of course we care about human rights. The security of the Iranian people is the most important to us. How can you say that when we know everything that's going on in Iran, the repression and the way, homosexuals and people of different religious beliefs, and we can go on and on, are treated in Iran. But it's this kind of rhetoric that, he's able to turn things around. Unfortunately, there are many people that don't buy it and understand that this is a joke, but I think that there's a certain amount of people that are actually receptive to this. He speaks very well. He speaks, excellent English. He kept going back, by the way, to Saddam Hussein. He wouldn't part with that. It's a difficult adversary when you think about how they present themselves to the world.
So it's a long way from understanding human rights and actually implementing it. We're drawing near to the end of the program, so I'd like to give each and every one of you a closing statement. Dr. Pardo, we'll start with you.
I think, let me just quote Rouhani in his speech for the 40th anniversary. He said that he hinted that the regime in Iran is basically a regime of oppression, and he said that they are in the worst economic situation ever.
Dr. Landau?
I think generally speaking, it's time, first of all, for the Americans and the Europeans to get back to productive conversations. There is a need to confront this regime. I think everyone knows what the regime is doing.
Mr. Oren?
Javad Zarif is to Khamenei what Tariq Aziz was to Saddam Hussein, and the policy vis-à-vis Iran is now a domestic issue in Israeli electoral process.
Gantz's problem.
Indeed. Well, this is all the time that we have for today, so I'd like to thank Dr. Pardo, Mr. Oren, and Dr. Landau for being here today. And I'd like to thank our viewers as well, and we will see you next time.
You just watched TV7 Jerusalem Studio. We encourage you to pray for the challenges raised in today's program. If you were blessed by our production, please consider supporting TV7 Israel. The details of our respective bank accounts for donations from Europe and the United States appear on the screen. Your generosity allows us to continue to serve God's calling, to broadcast content that truly matters through TV7 Israel from Jerusalem.